we're going to hear from first from Willie Pearson, who is at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and he will help set the scene for us, for our next two speakers. Willie.
Well, I think, Lydia, we have three basic questions, and I think the way we decided to do this, John is going to take part of the first question, then I guess Rita will be in there at the end. And I'm taking part of the last question, the third question that focuses on research. And I suspect that the three of us will have some similar kind of interest about what institutions can do. And I'm really glad that you use the term early people rather than old people. I really appreciate that. So let me start by what I've focused on primarily has been building a research base for changing the face of science and engineering. And I came at this kind of a backwards way. When I went to grad school for my doctorate, I'd actually planned on pursuing a degree in experimental social psychology. But unfortunately, the person who I went to study with was part of the Bell's study at Harvard and Yale, decided he would leave academics altogether. So I ended up deciding to stay and tough it out. And while there, I began to be invited to take a course on Sociology of Science, something that I had never heard of. And probably most people in the Southern region have not either. And this particular specialty deals with the interaction between science and society. And there's another component that deals with the technological part. So for this particular seminar, I wrote a paper, and it dealt with the, I guess more or less the representation of Blacks in science. And the reason why I did that is because the course started off that there were basically very few Blacks in science. And having grown up in a community where there were two HBCUs, I'd actually seen Black scientists before. And lo and behold, it turns out it was right. There was not very much in terms of scholarly literature. So a paper was able to be funded by the National Science Foundation, and that created another issue because at the time, NSF was broadly kind of identified by many Blacks in science as a racist institution. That has changed over time due to some of the people who will speak later. My specialty was actually founded by Robert K. Merton, who's at Columbia University and did his training at Harvard. But his wife was also one of his students, and she was a person who influenced me quite a bit. She wrote a small paper on Blacks and women in science, and it was presented, I think, at Caltech. This is a long time ago. But I've stayed in touch with her ever since. But one thing that led to is that there was basically no systematic research on people of color in science and engineering. So one thing I began to understand very early on, both sociology of science, which is primarily around the Ivy League schools, and sister specialties like history of science, philosophy of science, history of technology, history of medicine, had a race problem, just like the rest of science and engineering. There were just very few people doing anything related to the intersection between race and gender and sexuality at the time. And unfortunately, that hasn't changed a whole lot. So I want to spend some time talking about where things have traveled since that time. My dissertation was completed in around 1981. And I did one of the first systematic studies on the career patterns affected by race. So about 500 of my subjects were Black, about 700 and something were white primarily, and included some other non-Black populations. And so I had done what is called a cohort effect. I was really interested in how science had purported itself to be universalistic. In other words, the quality of your science is what mattered, not anything else, your location at institutions. And when I began to see that what happened prior to 1955 and the civil rights legislation that pertained to desegregation of schools, and then what happened after that up until around 1964, and then from 65 to 74, and that parallel, the last one was the Baca decision out in California that basically ruled that you could use race as part of an admissions criteria, but not solely that. And what I was able to find is that over that period of time, things did get a little bit better. When I first started, Blacks comprised about 1% of all doctorates, allegedly. But as I began to check into that, it was actually less than that, because a number of those people who were counted as PhDs in science were actually science education. Some of them had honorary doctorates. Some of them were not Black. So in reality, it was less than 1%. And I think, as Lydia did in the overview, things have improved, and they certainly have. But even today, the same population, I'm looking at Blacks, still comprise only less than 3 or 5% of all PhDs in science and engineering. So there's been some change, but not a whole lot. So I want to focus on what I experienced, and that is coming out being the only Black at the time in my specialty, and experiencing a sense of loneliness initially. But then I realized, being an older graduate student, I had to go out and find people, because at the time there was a lot of saying about participating on review panels and so forth and so on. We can't find any. So part of my whole motion and dedication was going out and finding people who could work together. So this was in the, I would say probably the early 80s, mid 80s, that there was a social movement. And I think that John and Rita can maybe speak to parts of this. And at the time, I was able to reach out to people across disciplines, because since I did do my work of interviews and surveys of scientists, I was very familiar with people in physics, chemistry, all of the sciences, because we did about 100 interviews. But I also realized at the time that sociology of science alone was not going to work in advancing the research, and that I could not do that alone. So it turns out that being able to reach out to people at AAAS, people at QEM, people what now is called SACNAS, but originally Richard and some of the colleagues had not formulated that organization at the time. So with this particular group, it became important because we were involved at foundations, we had people in professional organizations, there were people in the private sector. So it was a good time for people to coalesce, to be involved in how we could actually change the face. And I would say that, just for the record, all of these folks were concerned about a greater good. It was not about money. It was about advancing all of these groups, whether they were ethnic groups, racial groups, gender groups, sexuality groups, you name it, we had representation from all over. And I think one person sometimes who gets lost in history before I go into the research component is a person by the name of Anna Jane Harrison, who was a chemist. She spent most of her career at a small same-sex institution. And I think one thing that she was able to do, besides becoming the first woman to be head of, to be elected to chemistry, American Chemical Society, but also at AAAS. Anna Jane Harrison looked for what we call a rainbow coalition. There were just a few of us left. Unfortunately, she passed away in the late 80s. But what she did was to come out with this notion that there is a problem with the pathway, and that one of the problems that cuts across race, gender, class is the fact that in that first year class, the introductory classes, the attrition rate is tremendous. And so what happens, we need to try to address that to begin to retain various demographic groups in the field. So what she did was having Shirley Malcolm, I think, who might speak later. So the Rainbow Coalition was people who were from different disciplines. They were at different points in their careers. They included people in academia, outside of academia. And so part of that was a close connection to Sigma Xi. And at the time, Sigma Xi was trying to do a lot of things in terms of diversifying the field. What Anna Jane Harrison did was to make certain and report through Sigma Xi, through presented at Congress, that if professors were going to continue to have very high attrition rates in their classes. And if they wanted to get other faculty members or get improvements in their budgets, don't give them the money until they improve the retention rates. There's a famous case that dealt with, I won't call the state out, but where this was a test case. So the folks asked for additional lines for faculty, and the dean at the time said, no, until you improve the teaching performance in terms of retention. Well, lo and behold, the retention rate begins to increase. And so I think going from that, we had other issues. So let me speak to some of the research focus that this particular coalition was focusing on. And one, we knew that there were not enough people actually doing empirical research on why there were so few women, so few people of color in science and engineering. So we know we needed to have some data. We began to collect that across streams of NSF, NIH, NASA, but also in the academic community. And one thing that became very clear that while we were trying to do this, we actually needed to broaden the talent pool of researchers, because at the point in time, there were very few people who were actually doing research and having evidence that these particular issues were important and having some strategies on how they could be done. So one of the first things we decided to do, since there were not that many of us, we had to parcel what we were going to do. So we would have people who, like Shirley Malcolm and some others, focused on programming, advocacy, and there was just a handful of us who were actually doing research. But there were other people who were in leadership positions who were able to, in their institutions, to value the diversity. And so you do that by having it part of the evaluation process. One of the things we also did was to look at this whole issue at the time was very popular called pipeline. So we decided that was not a very useful term. So we focused primarily on pathways. And there was a study that came out of a workshop that we did at NSF. It was a cross-directed workshop with my colleague in computer science from Georgetown. And so one of the things that became very clear is that for the pathway model, you could get on, get off. And at the time, there were a lot of people who were people of color in particular who could not afford to go from the bachelor degree straight to the PhD. So some would stop and get a master's, work for a while and go back. But there was another thing that became important from a research perspective. We began to note that a number of the things that were out about historical figures, about museums, about libraries and so forth and so on, there was most of this heavy concentration on the first to do this, the first to do that. And so they were not even biographies, they were biographical sketches for the most part. Some of them turns out they were not accurate, but there were also other issues. So we know one thing that was definitely needed was to have more systematic, structured research where that the story could be told more fully. And that's why we needed to make sure that we got museums that were going to have certain programs or certain exhibits were evidence-based, research-based, and not this business of just the first to do this and the first to do that. But we realized that one of the problems was that there were very few people of color and women in history of science who did biography. Noted example is Ken Manning at MIT, and that still remains very limited. We also had very little work in terms of films, books, and sadly, when we did the Percy Julian film, it still comes out on PBS on most Januaries and Februaries, and we actually won the AAAS prize for developing that film. But even developing the film, and it was very popular, there still is no biography of Percy Julian. And besides what Ken Manning did with Black Apollo Science, that still remains very limited there in terms of full biographical works. So one thing I think that really helped with the research component is that we were not separated from other components, people who were actually dedicated in terms of going out in the field, holding programs. And to a great extent, NSF was very helpful along with some other issues. And I think CEOS in particular began to play a good role that we can come back to later. So one thing that was very critical is this collaboration across institutional types. And what I mean by that, we had people at Sloan who were very active. We had people later on at the Barrows Weapon Foundation, there was Ford, and we had a number of people who were embedded at different agencies. There was Harriet Jenkins at NASA, a sociologist, and they later named one of the programs after Harriet. But there were people throughout, and there were people at minority serving institutions, and to a less extent, two-year schools. So my point is that we had to have research coming from different waves and from different sources and from different institutions so that we would be able to have a more authentic picture of what was happening in terms of the research. Unfortunately, we still see not as much progress as scholars from minority serving institutions, especially HBCUs, actually doing the research that we were talking about. Another thing that happened was the focus on undergraduate research experiences. And at the time, there were the introduction of some of these programs in the late 70s and then the early 70s. Unfortunately, most of these programs, as you would see later on, were never rigorously evaluated. When we did one of the academy studies looking at training, we were just kind of surprised that the vast majority of the programs were not rigorously evaluated. And so trying to make a case for the value of those came into question for some people, but not those of us who were actually involved in supporting the institutions. Another research area that we saw that was very limited, and that was on gender. We began to see different groups focusing on gender in terms of leadership positions. So we had the advanced program, but even before that, we had the issue of the National Academies Committee on Women in Science, and I was on that for about 10 years. I think that was illegal. So, but the point was we began to do certain things, and we held the first workshop on women of color at the National Academy on women in color in engineering, science, and medicine. And that was a very successful effort to first time to bring in a focus on women of color. But we also realized over time that as some of us in Anna Jane Harrison's Rainbow Coalition, that there was the issue of sexism. And the sexism was pretty hidden in some cases in terms of the research, but also in terms of programmatic stuff. And this was both interracial, interethnic, but also intra. And we noted that there was a very reluctant issue to deal with among underrepresented groups, particularly racial underrepresented groups. The fact that there was a sexism issue, and there was the issue of this power and inequities that existed, and it had a profound impact on women of color becoming leaders in not only academy, but in other places. But there's another research area that we also focus on, and when that was recruitment and retention of faculty. And at the time, this was primarily Black faculty. So what began to happen is that there were a lot of efforts coming out of the 70s and early 80s about recruiting these particular populations. But at the same time, getting tenure and getting promotion was not really happening. And this was at predominantly white institutions. And around the same time in the early 80s, the majority of Black students did not attend HBCUs. They were at majority institutions of different types. So one thing that continues from that is that we have this issue of women in general getting tenure, and why so many are denied tenure, especially women of color in certain fields, even when they've had outstanding preparation at some of the top departments in the country. But we also have this other issue of women in general being stuck at the associate professor level. And so I'm not sure what has been happening now in terms of more recent research, but that remained a major problem where those who did get tenure were not able to advance. And we saw something similar in industry and in government. So one of the things we know we needed to focus on was another component that dealt with HBCUs, where they get a lot of credit for producing a disproportionate number of the Blacks who go on to get PhDs in STEM fields. But now we fast forward, and there are fewer and fewer of African Americans or Blacks who get their undergraduate degrees at these institutions. So what's not clear is what kind of impact that will have on the doctorate recipient population, because the counterparts are not being produced there. The proportion who are at predominantly white institutions are not producing their fair share of these individuals. But the other thing I want to return to just quickly is that while we had a plethora of programs being developed and a considerable amount of money being paid to finance these programs, but at the same time, very little was happening in terms of increasing the representation in the field. And some of us who work in the area of evaluation saw that many of the programs, too many, were not really evaluated, as I mentioned before. But then we had a project that was called the BEST project. There was a partnership, 5 minutes, between NSF, Qual Choice, and the Council on Competitiveness. And when we asked for evidence of proof that the programs were working, and we sent this out massively, it turns out very few programs that are supposed to be pretty well known could provide evidence of their effectiveness. So that remains an area that we still need to address. I think the other thing I would also end with is the fact that we really need to have more integration of the SBE fields, social behavior and economic sciences, involved in trying to do more work when it comes down to the underrepresentation. That still has not been fully integrated. But one of the things I'm very hopeful that someone would move beyond what I did in 1974. We have a lot of counts on how many got their degrees, but we still have very little knowledge of what kind of career experiences they've had once they got their degrees. I know from my study on chemists that there were issues with discriminatory practices in terms of promotion. There were also gender issues. The other thing we know that for some of the people who got their undergraduate degrees in science and engineering, there are many who switched fields as they went up the ladder for graduate school. And so we don't know why they leave as much, and we don't know why they stay. I think the other thing is that we need to have more diversity in people who do science and technology policy. That still is very underdeveloped. And I think one of the other things that we end with is that for many of us who started in this early group, should have had, and even though some of us called for that, we need to have a succession plan. How do you pass the baton on to the next generation? And I think many of us are kind of saddened that we didn't do a better job in that. But I am proud of the fact that we now see younger people and people who are building on the work that we did, and hopefully that would be sustained. So I think my time is up, and I think we can have the other dialogue with Rita and John as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Willie. That was wonderful and helps us remember, and for some of us, learn for the first time some of the things that you saw and the things that still remain as issues that need to be addressed. And I hope that people listen or later read about these.